Content warning. This presentation includes discussion of alt-right ideology and its impacts. Please do not watch if you are sensitive to mentions of violence, transphobia, racism, white supremacy, and murder. Thank you. Stay safe out there. Charlottesville, August 11th and 12th, 2017. The Unite the Right rally. I'm sure you saw this man's sweaty face in your Instagram feed or on your local newspaper. You've probably also seen this cartoon frog in those feeds as well, along with scores of impact font memes. But why, 3 years later, are we still talking about this event? What led up to this? What happened afterward? And what does the internet have to do with it? Charlottesville marked one of the first times that America came face to face with its neo-Nazi infestation. Here they were, protesting with a permit given by the city, unmasked, unlike their KKK predecessors. They were carrying firearms and shouting phrases like, "Gas the slur for Jewish people, race war now." But these attendants went beyond that, and by the end of the second day, actions of the alt-right protesters resulted in the assault and permanent injury of innocents and the murder of Heather Heyer. There has not been another widespread event like the one in Charlottesville since the rally. But the neo-Nazis have not gone anywhere. According to the ADL, white supremacists committed at least 73 murders in the 2 years after Charlottesville, including in events like El Paso, Parkland, and the Poway shootings, among others. Even our government is still plagued with alt-right ideology. Iowa's own Representative Steve King has a history of making incredibly racist comments, many of those comments even being repetitions of talking points used at Charlottesville. We have a problem. Should we allow expression of Nazi ideals, a dilemma that calls free speech itself into question? But before we can fix this, we need to change the way that we talk about hate speech. I've selected 3 sources to present among the many I researched for this topic. Here are the 2 ways that people approach this subject. On one side, we have the usually older people who advocate for complete free speech. They argue that America's core texts and ideology are mutually exclusive with any suppressal of hate speech. They often completely avoid talking about the internet and trivialize Nazi speech as something that will fizzle out on its own or is laughably harmless. On the other hand, there's a growing contingent of younger people who support a change, support taking hate speech seriously and fighting against it. They argue that Nazi speech is far from harmless and that its real-world effects should not be ignored. They also dive much deeper into the internet and the rhetoric of hate speech as a whole. All right, let's jump into it. First, I wanted to look at this controversy from the outside in, as well as contrast the present with a past experience that mirrors our own. In this case, the original Nazis. And I found that source in New York Times opinion piece, How Germany Deals with Neo-Nazis, written by a German writer, Anna Sauerbrei. First, she describes some aspects of German law. Notable among these is this concept that I cannot pronounce, but I will tell you what it means instead. It's the incitement to commit hatred. So in Germany, not only is alt-right violence and Holocaust denial not allowed, but one isn't even able to advocate for it. So in other words, a Charlottesville would never happen under the German system where yelling something like race war now would be illegal. However, despite being a foreigner, Sauerbrei makes distinctly American choices. One could even call them mistakes in her rhetoric, possibly to appeal to her American audience. She leans heavily on the idea of America being free and reflects those values in her language, while neglecting to really provide many concrete examples in favor of her point or refute arguments against it. This reliance on American mythos is a problem I found with so many of these articles. For example, the same uniquely liberalistic laws that America has that she praises are the ones that arrest a 12-year-old Latina schoolgirl for doodling on her desk, but protect far older white boys who threw up a Nazi salute in a school photo. When we talk about this, we need to stop pretending like America doesn't have censorship, and we need to think about more than just the feelings and expression of white men. I'd like to bring up another thing that she briefly mentioned at the very end of the article, which was just that this quote had been passed around her Twitter feed. You may have already seen this. It's a very popular infographic called The Paradox of Tolerance, which is based on Karl Popper's 1945 book. While I love the infographic and I think it's very helpful, I find his quote to be even more powerful. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and the tolerance with them. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant. I just said tolerate like 45 times, so let me back up a bit. As the infographic says, defending the tolerance requires us to not tolerate the intolerant. That's just something to consider as we move on. My next article is a perfect example of how so many people talk about hate speech. This piece was by David Goldberger, who spends the majority of the time explaining how 40 years ago he was an ACLU lawyer in the very controversial landmark case where he defended the right of white supremacists to protest through the town of Skokie, Illinois. Now, this article props itself in direct opposition to anyone who may consider limiting Nazi speech, although it never cites a specific argument or voice, and paraphrases what we can assume are his dissenters, who themselves are labeled with a hyper-specific they. Moving on, in between his bursts of waxing poetic about America's powerful and unparalleled free speech rights that will prevail against the forces of hate, just as they have in the past, he makes a few mistakes in logic. For example, he claims that the shrinkage of the First Amendment means expanding the power of the government to censor, and that never leads to good results. And then he immediately follows that by talking about the state of freedom in Russia and Venezuela, where journalists are gunned down because governments find them offensive. First, there are quite a few limitations that he as a lawyer would know, such as Brandenburg v. Ohio, where the government can punish speech that incites or promotes eminent lawless action and is therefore likely to produce or incite such action. You might be more familiar with the concept as yelling fire in a crowded theater, clear and present danger. Why didn't Goldberger mention this point, which is made especially even more relevant as Brandenburg was a KKK member? It's because he doesn't really have an argument against it, and that's what so many of these articles do. They don't include stories like Charlottesville, really. They don't include the death toll and everything that's happened because they don't have an argument against it. Secondly, Goldberger knows what he's doing when he picks Russia and Venezuela. The names of the not entirely capitalist countries send Red Scare shivers down the backs of most Americans. Additionally, governments finding gay people and journalists offensive is in no way comparable to shutting down Nazis with rifles from parading. Gay people have not murdered anyone with their gayness, and once you look past the fear tactics, this point is not only not relevant, it's ridiculous. What's most important here is what he doesn't write, however. Today's bigotry is no different from the bigotry in Skokie, says Goldberger, but what he ignores here that in Charlottesville alone, 3 people died. He ignores the fact that these alt-right ideals are being upheld by members of Congress, that the president's personal guards have QAnon patches. He's ignoring the fact that the internet has absolutely revolutionized the way that we share and receive information. These older authors don't want to talk about the internet and its effects in their arguments because they either don't understand it or don't want to seem foolish. When we talk about hate speech, we can't look at the past as an idealized, shiny version of itself, and we can't cling to it like Goldberger does. We need to look at evidence, not ideals. We need to include more than just tired arguments and look at it from every angle we possibly can. My final article today is from The Atlantic, entitled "The Joke's on Us." In it, Helen Lewis interviews several cultural anthropologists who studied the internet on the rise of alt-right ideals online. Lewis does not treat Nazi speech, especially memes, as silly or impotent. She provides numerous examples to the contrary. For example, the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan picked a deliberately ridiculous name. According to Ilan Franz Parsons' book, Ku Klux Klan, the KKK worked to portray victims' entirely rational fear of their physical violence as though it were superstition or gullibility. The victim, tellingly, failed to get the joke. Moving on, in 1931, as others argued that Hitler's overt anti-Semitism and advocacy for violence were just tactics that he used to rile his supporters, Jewish lawyer Hans Litten thought differently. As he prosecuted Nazis for an attack they made on a dance hall, he cross-examined Hitler and revealed his tactics of street violence to galvanize an army of them, overlaid with a veneer of plausible gentility to attract middle-class voters. Litten did not win the case and later died in a concentration camp. Keep the idea of plausible gentility in your brain. Today, this is still happening. For example, Boogaloo Boys, another white supremacist group, carry a stupid name and ridiculous Hawaiian t-shirts to distract from their assault weapons and a hunger for a second civil war. Lewis does not treat hate speech as a joke, and she doesn't treat its effects as one either. The names of the people murdered by the alt-right in all of the events that she mentions in just the last couple years are unfittable into the time frame of this speech, and those that have been victimized by Nazis number countless more. One of her final expert quotes is from an FBI director who told Congress earlier this year that the greatest threat we face in the homeland today is that posed by lone actors radicalized online. A racist meme or a Charlottesville chant is not a harmless, edgy joke. We need to realize that and treat it with the severity that it deserves. I chose this topic because I've seen firsthand what hate speech does. In January of 2018, a boy went missing. His name was Blaze Bernstein, and he went to my high school and was friends with many of my friends. We'd been putting up flyers for a week. Everyone had been looking for him when the police found a shallow grave. Blaze had been murdered. He was stabbed 20 times before he was even 20 years old in a park that his parents drove past every day. The man who killed him also went to my high school. How did they go from classmates to this? Well, his killer was a prolific member of sites like iFunny and 4chan. And he was becoming more radical as far back as 10th grade, as a live journal that a classmate of his sent me showed. He also posted hateful memes online where he still has support as horrible people make memes making fun of Blaze's death and say that he deserved to die to this day. Online, too, he met and joined Atomwaffen Division, a Nazi group that's responsible for several murders across the US. He sent pictures of dead gay men to Grindr matches and then escalated further when he killed Blaze because he was Jewish and gay. I watched as my whole community fell apart because of this. I sat with a friend as she cried over photos of them, some before school mornings. Nobody felt safe anymore. I watched his family grieve, and my entire school was just ripped apart because of his death. Above all, a bright, talented, kind, wonderful life was suddenly just gone. And jailing his killer isn't going to bring it back, and it's hard to make peace with that. I can't say that I know exactly how or if we should censor free speech. But after what happened to Blaze, after reading all these articles with mentions of events in other communities that likely experienced the same pain that mine did, I know that we need to approach this differently. We need to stop describing Nazi speech as ineffective or silly, because it's not. We need to stop acting like white men's right to spew hatred is worth as much as the simple existence of marginalized people. We need to move beyond just praising America for being free and ignoring the internet's impact. We need to bring this conversation into the future. Maybe then we can find a way to stop this hate. Thank you for listening. If you'd like more information on some of the Nazi symbols and dog whistles that I mentioned here, please go to the ADL's Hate Symbol Database. If you'd like to read more about Blaze or donate to the Blaze It Forward Foundation, please visit blazebernstein.org. Thank you again for listening.